Hold on.
Oh.
Rotate to record. There we go. Go. Yep, you're good.
Hi, everybody. This is Ian Trevethan. I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Sternberg Museum. And I've got with me our Museum Director, Dr. Reese Barrick. Excuse me. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about our home state and the things that we find in our home state. So, those of you that are tuning in, I know we've got some people that are not necessarily close by. I talked to one gal as far away as Germany in the last few days. So, in case you didn't know, we are located in in western Kansas. At least I said Kansas and not Montana. We are in Hays, Kansas, which is in western Kansas. It's not really a destination for a huge chunk of people.
We're literally halfway between Kansas City and Denver. So right on the interstate in the middle of the plains.
Classic plains.
Classic plains.
Flat. So, a lot of times I get questions about why did I choose to come to Kansas. Well, for me, my background is in vertebrate paleontology as well as Reese's. I think that's probably the common denominator that draws us here because Kansas actually has an amazing amount of fossils. And that's what we do. So one of the things that Kansas has that I don't know that a lot of other states, provinces, regions have is we've got state fossils. Not just one, but two state fossils. They're vertebrate fossils. So what is a vertebrate fossil versus an invertebrate fossil?
Vertebrate fossils have backbones.
So
invertebrate fossils are things like clams and snails crabs.
Feel like I'm pretty spineless. Does that make me an invertebrate?
Might be verging that direction.
Okay.
But I think I've seen it pop up every once in a while, so I think it's still there.
Only in grad school when I was a student. So can't remember what we're talking about now. It's been a rough week.
Hold on one second, guys. We are having little technical difficulties. So, I'm adjusting. Okay, that's better. Okay, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, the video is sideways, FYI.
Yep.
Did we fix that?
Did we fix it?
Let us know if the video is still sideways. So, in case you haven't noticed, there are three of us now in this entire museum. And it is very quiet, very empty, and I am slowly losing my mind. I would rather be here at the museum talking about museum specimens to the people that I normally talk to these things about. In fact, this is really cool because it gives us an opportunity to reach people even farther out than I normally would. So that's one silver lining with this. So that's great because otherwise I'd be in my house causing problems for my wife and daughter. So let's talk about our first state fossil.
Let's talk about state fossils. Kansas did not have a state fossil until 2014. Is that right?
Sounds about right.
So and we got
what year is it?
We got two state fossils designated at once, as Ian mentioned. So, and the fascinating thing is there's fossils all over the state of Kansas, but the western part of the state is famous for the Western Interior Seaway. So it's Cretaceous. So we're talking the seaway is 85 to 70 million years is when the state of Kansas was covered by a seaway, and so most of the famous fossils from Kansas come from the Western Interior Seaway. So we had two fossils that were designated as state fossils in 2014. And one of them, it was kind of interesting because there had been a bit of a history of different fossils being suggested as potential state fossils. I remember the first one was Xiphactinus, which is what our fish within a fish is.
We'll talk about that next week.
We'll talk about that next week, which is a very cool one. But there are several of us in the paleontological community that suggested a couple of other options. One of them being Pteranodon, which is our flying fossil that everybody's seen in Jurassic World. And the other one was a Tylosaurus, which is a mosasaur, and a very large mosasaur, probably second in size only to the actual Mosasaurus, which we don't find in Kansas. So we have sort of the large swimming state fossil and the large flying state fossil, which is really kind of cool. And we may talk about this a little bit, but there's no other state that has cooler state fossils than we do.
I would have to agree on that one. So we're going to talk about our first, well, not first, but our nearest state fossil to me. So this is a Mosasaurus. This is called Tylosaurus. And actually, it turns out there are two different kinds of Tylosaurus. There is Tylosaurus prorigor, which is what is on display here. And then there's another Tylosaurus called Tylosaurus kanzensis. So we just stopped at the Tylosaur level, which is what? That would be
Genus.
Genus level, okay. So we didn't get much more specific than that.
And it's an interesting thing, too, because the reality is some states have a state fossil called the crinoid. Well, a crinoid's, up there at order level or class level. So it could be there's thousands and thousands of species of crinoids. All right, so we went not at the class Vertebrata.
Hang on, let's step back for a second.
All right, let's go back.
So we just slipped into this dorky argument here about what level we have classified our own state fossils in. So the way scientists like to categorize things,
We like to put things in boxes.
yeah, that's just I think a human thing to do. We just like to put things into boxes and say, wow, this thing's like this thing and this thing's like. So we tend to classify things that have comparative features, whether they're things that are present or absent. That's a pretty useful thing.
We do this in Sesame Street.
We do?
Which of these things is not like the others?
It starts there. I blame Sesame Street.
Sesame
Street. So you can get really big and broad. So that would be your kingdom. Or you can get very, 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 very
Specific.
which is
Species.
So depending on how big of a look you want. So, when Reese was talking about vertebrata, what does that mean?
It means you have a backbone.
So vertebrata includes everything with a backbone. But it doesn't necessarily designate what kind of animal with a backbone, right? So vertebrata includes fish, birds, humans, monkeys, dogs, cats,
Lizards, snakes.
lions, tigers, oh my, and bears. So that's what we're arguing about and we could do this for hours and you would probably turn off this feed and I wouldn't blame you. So let's go back to our state fossil. This is a Tylosaurus. Tylosaurus is one of the larger mosasaurs that we find in this area of Kansas, in our area of the world. Tylosaurus is a marine reptile. It is not a dinosaur, and you will hear this a lot from me as we continue to do these live feeds. There are all sorts of sauruses. Not all sauruses are dinosauruses. So Tylosaurus is a marine reptile that is related, probably most closely, most closely living relatives are things like monitor lizards, Komodo dragons, and snakes. So we've noted similarities between these two animals. We would call a Tylosaur a varanid reptile, which is sort of a classification of reptile that does include things like monitor lizards, Komodo dragons, those kinds of things. So, and that's based on skull structure and different features of the skeleton, as well as body form and shape. So, that's what kind of animal this is. Now, when I say aquatic reptile, I don't mean that this animal hung out in the water and then came up on a rock to warm itself up. This animal was a permanent sea creature. It never came out on land. It found a way to be a full-time marine animal, meaning it lived in oceans, and it was still an air breather, so it would still have to breach the surface to breathe air, but beyond that, it made its home in the ocean. So that means that this animal did all sorts of really cool stuff with its body, including giving live birth. Most reptiles that we see today, usually with the exception of, say, rattlesnakes, usually give birth via laying a nest of eggs, say like a sea turtle.
So sea turtles live in the ocean 99% of the time, but the females do come out on land to lay eggs.
So not so long ago, we had these two competing ideas about these marine reptiles. One idea was that maybe they gave live birth in shallow seas. The other idea was maybe like the sea turtle, they occasionally pulled themselves onto land, dug a hole in the sand, laid their eggs, and went back to sea. Since then, we have found evidence that all of the marine reptiles gave live birth in shallow seas. We don't have a lot of evidence that they ever came up on land. And furthermore, when you look at mosasaur, there's not a whole lot of support in its chest region there. So I would imagine if this animal came up on land and found itself beached, it would have some similar troubles to a modern whale. It would probably crush itself under its own weight. It would probably have trouble breathing. So I don't see mosasaurs really being at all well adapted for land. So that's kind of an interesting thing. You know, these guys, these marine reptiles are sort of the first backboned animals to go back to the sea from land. So we could talk for days and days and days about all the things that have to happen to allow an animal to return to the ocean. And maybe we'll talk about that one of these days.
So,
but
we have a question.
okay.
Uh-oh.
So, Tara wants to know
Hi, Tara.
what it ate and how many teeth it had
Oh, well,
or has.
for the teeth.
Yeah.
So this is I think one of the lower jaws. And so let's count. Since we're talking about Sesame Street.
Let's see. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teeth more. 6, 7, 8, 9, and then missing one, 10. Here's another missing one, 11. So there's 11 teeth in the lower jaw, and there's also, if you tip it over a little bit, you can see where there's replacement. There's other teeth that are coming in. So the cool thing about mosasaurs, like with a lot of reptiles, is they replace their teeth constantly. So they don't have just 2 sets of teeth like we do, where we have our baby teeth and our adult teeth. There's always new teeth coming in for mosasaurs.
Right, so this is just the lower jaw. And then you got to remember the upper jaw has probably an equal amount of teeth on the upper jaw. And then there's actually a second set of teeth on the palate of the mouth. We call those pterygoid teeth. And I would say, 5 or 6 per row.
I'd have to go back and look.
Yeah, it's not as straightforward a question as one would think. So the answer is these guys had a lot of teeth. This is not a mouth you'd want to tangle with. And actually, what we're talking about, these teeth, in part, were what made Tylosaur an apex predator. So what do I mean when I say apex predator? What does that mean? Those are fancy words. So
It means you're at the top of the food chain. It means you get to eat whatever you want. And once you're an adult, there's probably not much for anybody trying to eat you.
So you'll notice, I'm going to hand this back to you. You'll notice on our Tylosaur mount over here that Tylosaurus has a very hinged-like jaw. So if you look at that lower jaw, you'll notice that there's sort of a hinge-like structure here. If you look at the circular bone that connects it to the rest of the jaw, oh, it's down here. So if you look at this, that actually allows the jaw to open fairly wide. And then when that jaw snaps shut, the lower jaw, if you want to look at me for a second, the lower jaw had an ability to sort of move like this. We call that ratchet feeding. So what this animal would do is it was an ambush predator. which means it would sit real still and wait for a prey item, like let's say a small plesiosaur or a shark or even a smaller mosasaur, to come by, and it would actually flick out its tongue, much like a modern snake or a monitor lizard would do. And what that's doing is it's kind of a combination of taste and smell, and has a special organ on the roof of its mouth that it would sort of rub the tongue against, and when it would get that right scent, for lack of better words, it would use its tail to create a big burst of speed, and then it would come and grab whatever that food item was in its mouth. And once you're in this thing's mouth, I think you're pretty much in trouble, because it was able to do that ratchet feeding motion. And between the upper teeth holding it still and the lower jaws sort of doing that ratchet motion, it could probably saw things into chunks and swallow those chunks whole. So we have a lot of evidence when you've got an animal that eats other animals that have bones and that animal dies, those bones are still in the stomach area. So we have lots and lots and lots of skeletons of mosasaurs, and specifically tylosaurs, that show that these animals ate whatever they could get their mouths on. Turtles, sharks, fish, plesiosaurs, other mosasaurs, probably pterosaurs and birds if they could get their mouths on them.
Ammonites and belemnites.
Ammonites and belemnites, yes. So all, anything that was in the ocean was on the menu for this guy. So really cool animal, but I'm kind of glad they're dead. So this guy is about 30 feet long. We think they got bigger. But this is a very, very well-preserved specimen. So this was we'll call this our state C fossil.
Swimming fossil.
Swimming fossil. So let's go and check out our other state fossil.
Before we move on, we had 2 questions.
Okay, questions are good.
Yes, we have one that says, where was the fossil found?
Okay, so this fossil was found in Gove County, Kansas, which is western Kansas, a little bit closer to the Colorado border. It's kind of classic.
2 counties over from us, to the west.
Yeah, 2 counties west from where we're at. So it's very classic western Badlands.
Chalkland.
So if you've ever heard or seen Monument Rock or Castle Rock, it's that area of the state where basically it's very flat, lots of chalk beds. Occasionally you get these sort of towering rock-like structures. What that is actually a little bit harder limestone that is actually resistant to being dissolved. So you end up with these really cool towers of limestone that kind of have these sort of monument-like shapes. So that's where we found this animal.
And then the second question is, how did this dinosaur sleep underwater, and how often did it surface to breathe?
Okay, first of all, I will repeat, every saurus is not a dinosaurus, especially mosasaurs and tylosaurus. So these guys are mosasaurs, they're their own thing. So remember that. If you remember anything from this little chat, remember that this is a mosasaur. Dinosaurs lived on land, mosasaurs lived in the ocean. So remind me again, the question was, how did this sleep?
How did it sleep underwater, and then how often did it surface to breathe?
Well, we think that these animals had the ability to hold their breath for quite a while. They probably had some special adaptations that allowed their circulation to use oxygen pretty effectively. But, they would have to breach the surface fairly often to breathe, just like any modern water reptile does. And just from observing its relatives, more like the lizard type relatives, like monitor lizards, they sleep pretty soundly underwater. I've observed we've got 3 monitor lizards, and they kind of just, our guys hang out in shallow water, and actually what happens is their lower part comes down, and they sort of just stand in the water and close their eyes and sleep. So I would imagine something similar. They may not have stood on the ocean surface, but they probably had eyelids, unlike snakes, and they probably just closed their eyes, and they were fairly weightless in water, and they just probably went with the flow.
Yeah, and they probably slept fairly close to the surface so that they could get a
a breath every
Yeah.
20 or 30 minutes if they were sleeping. Otherwise, if they're going to dive deep, that's for a specific purpose. They're going hunting.
Right.
Otherwise, they're going to spend most of their time very near the surface. So even if they're sleeping, they're going to be very close to the surface, so they can get a breath every.
Well, and there's some ideas out there too that suggest that these animals might have wanted to hang around the surface to keep themselves warm in cooler waters. But again, unless we can observe it, it's a little bit hard to tell. I've got my own ideas about that. We'll talk about that some other day. So, any other questions about our Tylosaurus?
What period did it live in?
So this animal lived in what we call the late Cretaceous period. So this guy would have lived between about 70 and 80 million years ago.
Gotcha. And then what kind of fossil evidence does the museum have for predator-prey interactions with Mosasaur Ian?
We've got a lot of pretty good evidence of predator-prey relationships. So let's show you. We'll show you some evidence. We've kind of seen this before, but this case over here is a great example of predator-prey relationships. So if you look over here, this is part of a mosasaur backbone. So these are 3 mosasaur vertebrae. And if you look at where the blue arrows are pointing, what those are teeth marks left behind in the bone. And if you look at that orange circle, if you can see that, actually there are 2 orange circles. There's one sort of where, I guess, sort of left of the middle vertebra. You can see that there's a shark tooth embedded in there. And then if you look all the way to the right to the end of the first vertebra, there is another shark tooth embedded in there. So this is evidence of sharks preying upon mosasaurs. And it may be in this case that the mosasaur was already dead and that the sharks were probably scavenging this mosasaur. So if we move over to the right, this is a mosasaur rib. And in this case, it looks like there's evidence of healing. You can see there's a lump towards the lower part of the rib. We call that a paleopathology. That's evidence of some sort of injury and healing. And then embedded in that was a small Squalicorax shark tooth in there. So again, evidence of sharks preying on mosasaurs. Now, if we come over here, so what's going on here, and there's a little bit of discussion about this one. This is an ammonite shell. Now, ammonites were invertebrates that lived in the seaway. Again, invertebrates are animals without backbones. So this animal is related to a squid, but the big difference is this animal has a shell protecting it. So a lot like a modern nautilid that we can see today in today's oceans. So what these blue arrows are pointing at here are marks in the shell. And the really interesting thing is the patterns of the marks match up incredibly well with the top teeth of a mosasaur. So if you look closely, you can see outer teeth, and then you can see sort of a second set of teeth in the middle. And that tracks pretty well with mosasaurs' top teeth, with that second set of teeth on the pterygoidal teeth that mosasaurs have. But there is also a question of, well, are these really mosasaur teeth? Or are they boreholes left behind by limpets, which are also invertebrates that were sort of parasitizing, I guess, the ammonite. So could be either one. I think the pattern suggests it's more likely a mosasaur bite, but again, these are things that we have to look very carefully at because we're not able to observe these interactions in real time. So if you were to go down one more here, there we go. So this is actually another Tylosaurus canzensis skull. And we've seen this before, but we'll talk about this again. If you look at the blue arrows and where they're pointing to, and you may have to kind of squint to see it, but at the tips of each of these arrows are bite marks. And the bite marks match up very well with another mosasaur. So what we think happened with this animal is we think this was a younger, smaller mosasaur, and it actually had its head crushed by a larger mosasaur, which tells us a couple of things. Number one, mosasaurs were not afraid to bite other mosasaurs. And number two, this may indicate that these animals were pretty territorial, and that this younger mosasaur got too close to an older mosasaur and paid the price for that.
And this particular skull is of a Tylosaurus canzensis, which is also a state fossil because it's a Tylosaurus. But the species canzensis was a smaller mosasaur than the Tylosaurus prorigor, which we were looking at earlier, that was 33 feet long.
And we do have some evidence of cannibalism in mosasaurs. We have actually larger mosasaurs that have gut contents with smaller mosasaur bones in the stomach area. So if it could get its mouth on it, it would eat it.
Yesterday, when we were looking at turtles and tortoises, we had the skeleton of a protostega, which is similar to this. Well, this is a protostega also, but the actual fossil of the one that we were looking at yesterday has also tooth marks in it from a Tylosaurus. So we know that they ate turtles. We've got ammonites, other mosasaurs, plesiosaurs,
fish, sharks.
And we also have, actually, if you go to our Prairie Ocean exhibit, there is a mosasaur over there that actually has belemnite fossils, looks like little cigar things that are basically squid-ish looking animals, very similar, except they have this little internal skeleton of calcite, and those are in the stomach of the mosasaur on exhibit over there.
So I think we will go through the Long Time No See exhibit on Monday afternoon.
We'll get a chance to see that again.
That is I think it's Monday afternoon. Anyways, it's on the list. We'll definitely go through there. So if you're wondering what we're talking about, hold tight, you'll see it. So, any other questions about mosasaur specifically, or Tylosaur? All right, so let's head over to our second state fossil. All right, so we have our sea swimming state fossil, and then this is our flying in the air state fossil. So these animals are called pteranodons, and they belong to a group of animals called pterosaurs. Again, just because they're a saurus doesn't mean they're a dinosaur. All of these animals were sort of contemporaries. They lived at the same time, but they weren't necessarily the same kind of animal. So these guys also lived at the same time as dinosaurs and mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, but they're their own group of animals. So these are an example of one of the first, I guess, flying backboned vertebrate animals. Do you want to do the introduction on this?
So, yeah, so pterosaurs go back into the Triassic, and so they've been around for a long time, and they go from really small sparrow-sized things to really giant things that were as big as a Cessna, small airplane. So some of them even almost bigger than that. If they were standing, they're about as tall as a giraffe. So they get to be giants. So they a huge size range in pterosaurs. But what we have in Kansas are a whole bunch of groups of flying ones that were really cool because they flew over the ocean and they were basically fish eaters. So similar to a lot of the denizens of the ocean that were eating fish, pteranodons also did. But there's several species of pteranodon, and what we've got here are both of our species. Here's Pteranodon sternbergi, which has the really cool head crest.
I always say he looks like Elvis. Hey there, ladies.
And then we also have Pteranodon longiceps, which we don't have the bones here, but it's got a much narrower, pointy crest than the sternbergi.
We do have a female skull that has a less exaggerated crest.
Down here. So all of these animals belong to Pteranodon, which are these flying reptiles.
And they're really, these guys are cool because, again, they're fish eaters and they're swimming over the ocean. And interestingly enough, most pteranodon fossils are found in Kansas. There's a few in a couple other close by states, but they are only really found in our seaway, in the Cretaceous Seaway, which makes them very special to Kansas. And they're also interesting because their bones, because these things had to be really giant. You can see that the wingspan on these guys are huge. So from tip to tip, these guys have a wide wingspan. They could fly for long periods of time. Their size allows them to, they have powered flight, but they could also glide like a lot of large ocean-going seabirds, like an albatross. They can use the thermals to glide for long periods of time, which allows them to swim long distances over the ocean. And by being able to swim for long distances, then they can catch lots of food, and they spend probably more time flying over the ocean than they do anywhere else.
All right, we got some questions coming in.
Okay.
Why did the males have bigger crests?
Well, you know, there's a number of reasons, and for when we have animals that have what we call sexual dimorphism, which just simply means that males look different than the females, there's usually a reason, and it usually has to deal with selection, sexual selection. So oftentimes it's the females maybe looking at the males to say, what makes you a more interesting, worthy mate than some other male? And so oftentimes those large crests may be a function of that. So basically selection of knowing that you're a male, but how healthy of a male, how cool of a male are you that we might want to reproduce together.
So there's another question here that says, what does the male versus the female look like? So Rachel, if you could focus in on our female over here. So what we're looking at right now, that is a female Pteranodon longiceps. So you can see her crest is actually not very big. It's what I would consider under exaggerated. So if you were to go up to our male up here, which like we said, we don't have a complete skull here. We've got sort of an outline of what the skull would look like. You can see that his crest is much more exaggerated, longer and pointier. So that's a good example of what we call sexual dimorphism, which is just a fancy way of saying that a male or different sex has a much more exaggerated feature than, say, a female. So another question we've got is, what was their wingspan? Well, wingspans could get pretty big depending on the kind of pterosaur you're looking at. Pteranodons, probably the size of a glider, like an ultralight type glider would be the closest thing that I think I would compare it to now. They got fairly big, but
Total wingspan is probably around 20 feet.
Yeah. But,
in that area.
Some pterosaurs in general got as big as fighter planes.
Yes.
So they could get pretty big, and then the smaller ones were about the size of bats. So it just sort of depends on the kind of pterosaur you're looking at, and
But for pteranodons, for our state fossil,
for our state fossil,
we're talking probably 18 to 25 feet in wingspan. So they were really pretty. They were pretty large for pterosaurs. Not anywhere close to the largest, but still really quite large. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. How did they get in the air, and how did they fly, and how could they fly so far? And part of that is sort of like birds. Pterosaurs had very thin bones to make them very light. So if we look at some bones, we've got, here's a finger bone, and so it looks pretty big this way. They got flattened and crushed during fossilization, but they did so because they're so thin. So this has both sides of the bone kind of crushed together. It's a very, very, very thin, delicate bone, which allowed these pteranodons to be very light. If you look at the whole pteranodon picture up here, you can sort of get an idea of how big it was. And while that looks to be really, really large, they
an animal like this probably didn't weigh more than about 70 pounds. So it's actually a pretty small, as far as weight, for the size that it actually is. And that's because their bones are so thin and fragile. We've even got here's a vertebra of a pteranodon. And again, it's sort of crushed, but you can see really how thin and delicate the bone is. So that's really how they were able to get up and stay in the air with their powered flight, and then it was easy to stay aloft gliding in the thermals because they were so light.
So that begs a question. How did they glide across an ocean?
Well, again, they were fairly light, and they would basically, the Cretaceous was a pretty warm period, so there was lots of warm air currents, and so there would be fairly warm thermals everywhere, which would allow them to get up fairly high in the air and be able to sort of get a good view and vision of the ocean surface. And they had powered flight, so they didn't just glide. Once upon a time, there was an idea that they had to jump off of a cliff in order to get airborne, and all they could do was glide. We know that's not true. They could walk, they could take off from the ground or from the water. They could actually take off and fly. And so they had powered flight, which would allow them to fly long distances, but then they could, because of their huge wingspan, which gave them a lot of surface area to catch thermals and to catch the air masses and waves, they could stay aloft gliding for a long time, simply because of their huge, long surface area of their wings.
So Josh Fry, I see your question. We'll have to get back to you on that when we have our paleo collection staff back in-house. Right now, most of the museum staff is working from home. So that's a very technical question that could probably be best answered through our collections manager. So I will definitely forward that question to him, and we'll get back to you on your question. Charlie wants to know if these pterosaurs, these pteranodons, were like ducks or geese and were able to land on water. It's a tough question to answer,
It's a tough
Charlie.
question. The likelihood is that most of the time down in chase of capability, the likelihood is they might have been able to take off if they got stuck at the surface. They might have been able to take off, but it would not have been a safe place for them.
Well, and what we're left with to really interpret from are the fossilized bones, which when you think about how many of these animals were actually alive when their time was happening, and the percentage of those individuals that actually made it to become fossils, and then the percentage of those animals that actually became fossils that were actually found by somebody and brought to the right place to do research on, we only have a fraction of a slice of an idea of what these animals did as a whole group. So what we're left with is some fragmentary material that we have to try to do our best testing on. I don't want to say necessarily guessing, but we look at structures, we compare structures to other similar kinds of animals. We form ideas or hypotheses, and then we test those hypotheses and try to find the best support for those ideas that we're trying to test. So we're left with what was preserved in the fossil record. So not a whole lot of behavioral evidence. One of the things we do know is we think these animals were quadrupedal, which is a big fancy word for saying they walked on all fours. Now, I saw earlier that Candy was asking what is their leg span. Well, you can see if you look at our specimens here that their legs are far shorter than their arms are. But we have actually found trackways of pterosaurs in different parts of the world that show that they were actually walking on all fours. So when I imagine these things running around, I'm a big nerd, so I watch a lot of nerdy stuff. I think of the movie The Dark Crystal. There are these animals that the Gelflings rode.
You are a nerd, aren't you?
I am a huge nerd, but they run on all fours. And I kind of imagine a pterosaur sort of looking like that. Sort of this sort of interesting little sort of almost like a little animal on stilts, because if you look at their arms and even their legs, they're very stilt-like. So I would imagine, them walking on all fours looking very otherworldly compared to some of the animals that we see today. So if you imagine what a bat looks like when it tries to walk around, it's very awkward looking. I would imagine these guys were a little more mobile than a bat would be, but I don't know, because I can't observe them walking. All we have are their tracks and their bones. So does that make sense? Hopefully?
Maybe possibly.
Maybe possibly? All right. So do we have any more questions? Did they eat fish? Well, we think many of them did. Certainly the pteranodons that we're looking at were fish eaters. The smaller pterosaurs might have eaten insects or...
There's lots of, like I said, smaller pterosaurs, earlier ones. There's a lot of pterosaurs that have teeth and have tails, and a lot of those were probably insect eaters. But the large ones like pteranodon were definitely fish eaters. So our state fossil was a fish eater.
Okay.
So just as a end thing here, I mentioned something briefly that we have the coolest state fossils.
And just to remind you, we are in Kansas.
We are in Kansas.
Western Kansas, in Hayes, America.
In Hayes, America. So just as a comparison, right? Kansas and Nebraska has a little bit of a rivalry, right? Nebraska thinks they're cool because they have 3 state fossils, but they're all mammoths. They have a woolly mammoth, a Columbian mammoth, and what's the other one?
I don't know. It's a mammal. It's furry.
It's all
and it has
mammoth.
glands. Ew.
They're basically all the same thing. They're just mammoths, right? They don't have this flying cool pteranodon and this giant swimming tylosaur. So
Yeah, we have sea and air.
we have sea and air, which is really
Every
cool.
once in a while, we'll find a mammoth here.
And let's see.
So,
Let's take. I can even take a quick rundown for you if you want. If anybody's got questions about state fossils.
yeah, if we miss, if you live in an area that, let's say, is not in the United States, that we don't cover in our cool little list that we're going to look through here, send us what your state fossil, your
Yeah.
region fossil is.
Come at
or
us and tell us what your state fossil is and why you think
province fossil or whatever you've got.
it's cooler than ours.
If you don't yet have an official fossil, what do you think it should be? Let us know.
Yeah.
We want to talk about this.
So yeah, Alabama's got a whale. Georgia has shark tooth. It's just shark tooth is their state fossil.
That's like finding a penny in your pocket, right?
Idaho has a horse. It's just a fossil
Well,
horse.
yeah.
Horses are cool, but it's come on, it's
being from Eastern Washington, that's Idaho for you. Although I think Washington, isn't their fossil a mammal or a mammoth?
Oh, let's see. Washington is a Columbian mammoth. See,
Come on, Washington, you can do better than that.
there's like 5 states that have a Columbian mammoth as their state fossil. That's not unique, or come on, really.
Well, I was just a joke.
South Carolina is a mammoth also.
Mammoth.
Same thing, very very mammoth. South Dakota is cool. They have a triceratops.
That's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool, but it's not 2 with a swimming one and a flying one.
I know, but it's a triceratops.
It's
Triceratops.
pretty cool.
Mary says NC has megalodon. Is that the state fossil?
North Carolina.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Megalodon is big.
Megalodon is big and cool, but it's a swimming. It's kind of like Tylosaurus and Megalodon are kind of equal in their coolness, but we also have a Pteranodon, so they don't.
Yeah. Do your megalodons fly? Well, megalodons are cool. We actually get a lot of kids in here asking about megalodons, and they're really disappointed. Actually, we're going to talk about sharks later, I think, later this afternoon. We'll touch on that a little bit, but I wish we had a megalodon here just to make the kids happy.
That's
We got lots of other sharks, though. We'll show you.
we have all kinds of.
We're going to show you those sharks.
Cool sharks. But even in Kansas, we could go further. We don't have a state fossil plant, so we've got here in Kansas we have the greatest number of fossil grass seeds of any place in the world. So we could come up with a fossil plant, which would be kind of cool. So if anybody think about things that we should have potentially. We don't have a state invertebrate fossil, right? So We haven't made Inoceramus the state invertebrate fossil. So there's all kinds of cool things that we could even think about turning into a state fossil.
So we have a good question in, that I missed earlier. I think it was from Tavian. Hopefully I'm saying that right. If I mangled your name, I'm sorry. And he was asking what the top flight speed of a pteranodon would be. What do you think?
Ooh.
I mean, remember, yeah, they were able to flap, but not continuously like a bird. So, I would say look up, how fast a glider can go, and I would imagine.
I would say you probably want to go with something like an albatross.
How fast can they go?
How fast can an albatross go?
I don't know.
That's a good question.
We're in the world of Google. Let me find out.
But, smaller pterosaurs would have been a lot faster because some of them could flap really rapidly and fly like sparrows and pigeons and things. They could fly pretty quickly. The pteranodon, our state fossil, is not going to be able to probably fly extremely fast because, for one thing, they were probably not diving birds. Like you see a lot of ocean birds that take off and they fold their wings up and they dive into the ocean and go underneath and then catch some fish and then kind of swim back to the surface and take off and fly again. Things with such huge wingspans as pterosaurs and with weird, large head crests are not really built for diving into the ocean. So they were mostly gliders and big sweeping flyers. So probably fairly slow speeds.
So an albatross can fly at about 127 kilometers per hour or 78.9 miles per hour. So if we were to compare our pteranodons to something like that flight speed, there you go. So not slow.
Not slow, but they're not flying like falcons or things like that that are predatory, flying to catch other birds and things like that.
And they're gliding.
They're gliding.
So someone wants to know, while we're back to our pteranodon, what do they eat and how do they hunt?
That's a pretty good question. Again, we can't observe these animals living, so we have to sort of extrapolate from where we find them and how we find them and what's left of them to find.
And what's their morphology, and the size of their wings and their funny head crests suggest that they basically were catching fish at the surface of the ocean, because we know that they were swimming or flying over the ocean for long periods of time, and they were fish eaters predominantly. So they're probably catching fish that are at the surface of the water, very likely. Again, we don't have movies of them, but everything about their morphology suggests that they were probably catching things at the surface, flying over the surface of the ocean.
So when Reese says the word morphology, we're talking about the shape and size of their bones and their body shape. And the way we get this information is, of course, we measure the fossil bones, and we look at the shape and size of the fossil bones, and then we find something very similar to compare it to. Sometimes it's not an exact match as far as the kind of animal it is, but we can look at things like pelicans, like fishing birds that we have today, and sort of extrapolate or guess or compare and contrast from there, and sort of propose that this might be how these animals were able to hunt. I have actually seen some paleo artists suggest that these animals were divers, like some of the diving birds we see today. Again, that's a very, very hard hypothesis to test. In my mind, I think it just looks like a really nice piece of art, but I don't know that there's a lot of physical evidence for that.
But one of the things we do is we use the present as the key to the past in some senses, look at what things do today, and then compare the morphology or the shapes and sizes of things to hypothesize what they were doing in the past.
Okay, and then kind of talking about how did they have babies. So we had one talking what size were they when they were born, and then did they build nests?
All right, well, let's come over here. I can kind of help to answer some of that. So if you look at this weird bone down here that says built for birth. So what that is those are hip bones That is the pelvis of a female. Oh, actually, that's a pelvis of a male pteranodon. And we're able actually to tell the difference between male and female because if you look at, let's see if I can get my fingers in your way. If you look at the right side, there's a hole there. And that hole is relatively small, and that's how we know that's a male. The females, by contrast, have a larger hole. And the reason there's a larger space in a female pelvis is because they needed to bring the young through there. Now, there's not, they may have given live birth, but we think they probably more likely laid eggs.
And did they build nests, you think?
Again, I'm not sure of that answer. Reese, do you know anything about nesting behavior of?
Well, they had some sort of nest, yes, but what they were made out of, I'm not sure that we know very well. But we do have eggs that have been found of pterosaurs. So we do know that they laid eggs, and they would lay them in clusters. There's even hundreds of them that have been found in China. They've been found in a couple places around the world. So we know that they were egg layers and not giving live birth. So I'm not sure. I'd have to look up, but I don't know that we have any evidence of what it is they made their nests out of.
I don't know.
We'll have to look that up. Maybe we'll look. You can look that up. See if you can go out and find. We all have Google. See if we can look up, because I know there's a couple of papers that I've seen about pterosaur eggs.
Dr. Chris Bennett, if you're out there somewhere, throw us a line. So yeah, any other questions?
What was their wingspan?
Again, pteranodons, we're looking at about 20 feet at maximum.
Let's see. Sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry. It's okay. Rachel's doing. I want everybody to know that the third person here is Rachel Unruh, and she's running the camera, the mic, and looking at the phone to get your questions and giving us your questions. So she's doing triple duty all at once.
Yeah, when we started out, we had 4 or 5 people in the back, giving us questions, and then, they got more and more strict about who could come in, and now we're down to 3 people. So go, Rachel! Thank you so much for helping.
Thanks. So we have a question about how far did they fly over the inland sea from
That's
land?
A great question, and we think many, many, many miles. We think these were probably migrating animals. Again, we have to compare and contrast with some living animals. So there might be a couple of reasons why these animals would migrate. Number one, they got a food source they got to follow. So if their food source has a migration pattern, they're going to follow where that food source goes. Number two, there are a lot of birds out there that migrate when it's time to have young. And they go to a certain place where they do the mating thing and then they do the nesting thing. So we think that possibly that might have driven where they go and how they migrate.
One of the interesting things is for pteranodons, we don't find a lot of them in their nesting habitat. So we don't find them in like river sediments. We find them mostly all in the ocean. One of the coolest fossils that I've ever seen, that I found, I used to work at a museum in Utah. And one time we were out digging at a site that had all baby dinosaurs. It was all baby dinosaurs called Eolambia, which are kind of like duck-billed dinosaurs, very primitive duck-billed dinosaurs. And there's a bunch of baby dinosaur bones. And in the middle of this, we found this one weird bone that was kind of long and thin, and we were trying to figure out what it was. Turns out we found a pteranodon bone in Utah in terrestrial sediments, which is really rare because they're thin, so they get crunched and crushed. And we
So that means that pteranodon, that pterosaur, was really far west of where the seashore was.
Which suggests that they probably came from the west and the east and covered the whole seaway. So it's likely, if you think about that now, where I'm talking about is about a 10-hour drive, 11-hour drive from Hays, Kansas. So flying it, that's probably, if you're flying 70 miles an hour,
And driving at 70 miles an hour,
yeah, it's
It
a
equals out.
12-hour flight. So
Yeah.
they could have done that. They would have flown pretty much all over the whole seaway.
But that does bring into question, we do find a lot of pterosaur material in ocean sediments, in the rock that would have been underwater. And it makes you think, what caused so many to go down with the ship, so to speak? Was it weather? What happens if these animals get caught in a storm out in the middle of the seaway? Or was it that they just got old and got tired, couldn't make the journey anymore? So there's lots of questions. Sometimes you're left with more questions than answers when you're working with fossils.
Which is good because it means, especially if you're a younger person, let's say you're in elementary school, there are still questions out here for you to grow up and answer
They're
that we don't
always
have.
good questions. And I haven't been able to sleep for about 15 years because of all the questions in my head. So if you guys answered some of them, maybe I could get some sleep when I'm old.
Okay, that's it for questions.
Okay, we're going to sign off for now. We'll be back at 2 o'clock Central Time this afternoon, and we'll talk about sharks.
Or we could come back at 3 o'clock Eastern time, or 1 o'clock Mountain time.
Mountain Time.
Don't confuse people.
What about the Pacific Time?
Noon.
I don't even know where I'm at now. Can't remember what I was doing 5 minutes ago.
Yep.
All right, guys, we will see you soon. I am Ian Trevethan. This is Dr. Reese Barrick. As always, please, 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 please share, like, and send us messages. We are here to just interface with you guys because I know it's no fun being home, which is why I'm here. So we are going to be here every weekday for as long as we can do this. So the longer you guys stay interested, the more we can do this. So we'll see you this afternoon.